Boo! Made you jump. Like a zombie you forgot to double tap to the head. We're back from the dead. We follow on from our Halloween episode to talk more about horror games to fill you with dread. Let's slither into the episode and take a bite in the night. Hello everybody! And we're back. We're back once again. We had an epic Halloween episode last time, so we had to follow it up because otherwise you'd have 4-hour episodes, which I'm sure quite a few of you would like. But in this episode, we've decided to talk about all things Halloween and scary and East versus West types of horror and many things more. Joining me is Valentina Chrysostomou, who can say hello at any point once we take her out of her coffin and say, "Rise!"
Hello, everybody.
We also have Jonathan Dread Wilson, who has been scaring people in the attic. Hello, Jonathan.
I don't know what to scare people in the attic. Sometimes it's just bursting through doors. But hey, everyone.
Okay, there are options. I mean, you have to keep it fresh, you know. And Robert Rigor Mortis McLachlan is back from the dead too, joining me. Hello, Robert.
I haven't quite reached rigor mortis, but it's very good to be here.
Yeah, you're floppier than I expected for someone with rigor mortis. Last episode, if you haven't listened to it, get on your podcatchers, on your whatever device you're listening to stuff on, and go and have a listen, because we're continuing from that. We talked about loads of different things in the last episode, and we came up with a whole bunch of ideas that we wanted to investigate further. So I wanted to kick off this episode because one thing we touched on was a lot of remake games that feel more Western than their Eastern counterparts, right? So there's been a bit of I'm not going to say East versus West, but there's a very kind of Japanese tradition of games compared to Western kind of games. I mean, okay, I'm looking at around the room. There is somebody here who worked on Silent Hill. So that's kind of a very representative one. But we also have, Resident Evil games, which kind of have been remade recently. And they feel a lot more Western than the originals, right?
Yeah. I mean, you've got games going back all the way to the Super Nintendo, haven't you? Games like Clock Tower.
Right.
We've got a list written down here just for the listeners at home, just a sort of crib sheet to make us think about things to talk about. And yeah, there's been generations of these games have been made and many, many sequels added because they have always sold really well. I think that Western audiences have got a real yen, if you forgive the expression, for Eastern horror, especially Japanese horror, which has carried a load of these, what you could horribly call franchises, to some of the best loved games on especially PlayStation.
Right. Fatal Frame, was that the PlayStation, or am I getting...
That was on PlayStation 2, I believe.
I just got my PlayStation 2 back. I might have to give it a little go.
Yeah, I played Silent Hill on the PlayStation, obviously. Silent Hill 2.
I have Silent Hill 2 on my desk, ready to go into the PlayStation. I only need a special dongle to bring back technology from the 90s. So somehow I can plug in a PlayStation 2 into a modern TV.
I still think it's the best way to play Silent Hill 2. Because the remasters are terrible. Yeah, it's a glorious experience.
And Silent Hill is a great example for this East versus West type of design, because I think with Silent Hill 5 Homecoming and Silent Hill Downpour, we see a lot of that Japanese sort of style of horror fade away. And I think one of the controversies that we had with, more like, I don't know, a fan outrage, I guess, was the fact that it wasn't really doing Silent Hill justice. It kind of shied away from the lore and just the craziness that Silent Hill had, and just the risks that those type of horror games take in comparison to the new releases we get from Western studios that are a bit safer and more unoriginal, if that can be a word we can use.
In that shift you're talking about where it started to become more westernized, was there a shift in developers? Was like development shifted from, like, let's say a Japanese based studio to a Western one? Because that was going to be one of my things about this East versus West thing. You were going back to the PS1 and Sega and everything like that. All these games started out coming from Japanese like development studios. So Capcom came out and they kind of kickstarted a survival horror genre on the PS1 with the original Resident Evil, like through to Resident Evil 3. So then West can only be influenced by that and then start to put their spin on it. So I think that's what we started to see, like when you're talking about the Silent Hill changeover, it's the influences kind of crossing over with each other and Western starting to win out.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. I mean, you've got to, I guess another point to that argument is the fact that Silent Hill is really a Japanese response to American horror. So
it's a bit of a feedback loop, right?
it is. It's a real feedback loop that keeps going backwards and forwards, and both sides are sort of feeding from each other. Yeah.
But I think it's trying to find the balance, right? And like we said, this is a feedback loop. It might have started in the East because that's where a lot of game developer studios were at the beginning. But as they started cropping up around the world, especially within America and within Europe, that's where we started to see different influences come into these development cycles, which is just the different mentalities. And then the market's a whole different story to pull into it after that.
What's the most recent Japanese horror game you guys have played?
New one or remake?
Whichever.
Obviously, Resi is the
Resi 3, I think, is the.
Was it made by Japanese studio?
Well, no, I guess it's got a legacy, so it's not made by Japanese studios.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's Evil Within made. Yeah, Evil Within was made from. So I think that's the most recent one. Everything else was like Alien Isolation or Outlast were made by either an American company or a company in the UK. So I think that was the most recent one, and that you can see the differences. They're a bit more crazy with the things they add. Things don't have to make sense exactly. They're deeper. There's a deeper like logic and lore and backstory. And then when you play in comparison a game like Outlast, it's a bit more simpler. You go into this whatever, I don't know if I'm mistaken, like hospital, and then things happen. There's like psychopaths in there, and it's like, okay, it's pretty clear. It's just another horror game, which is very terrifying, but the concept is a little bit more simpler than playing Silent Hill or Evil Within, and you have all these crazy things happening, and you have no idea what is happening half the time. So I think that's the main difference that I see in those kind of games.
And this is completely unprepared for this episode, so massive apologies and I'm making massive assumptions. But I think in Japanese culture, there's a bigger tradition, I think this is through Shintoism, that there is different spirits and ghosts in various things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that deeper lore kind of comes out in games. Like, what are the most famous films of the 90s, of like The Ring and The Grudge and all these things, that there's a spirit in the house that has got of revenge that stays behind, these kind of deeper laws and deeper things that, like, well, obviously that house is haunted because someone had an argument and they didn't properly do XYZ to dispel that. Or do you see what I mean? Is that kind of mythology? I don't know if that's the right way to present it.
I wonder if how much of it is to do with publishers as well, and the risks that publishers were prepared to take. I would say that in Western audiences, when the video games market went through its various evolutions, I think that horror wasn't really a big part of that, especially in the US. And so that kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that horror games weren't made because people didn't think that they would sell. And then when the Japanese games came in, there was a tremendous hunger for them. And suddenly people realized that horror games are something that people do want to play. I mean, I'm not to say that there's definitely, I'm sure there are loads and loads of exceptions that prove the rule that were happening, that were being made at the same time. But as I think it goes into sort of cycles of horror, I think horror is the undead genre that refuses to die. It's a real bellwether genre, where very popular in the indie sector, very popular in...
This is for movies as well, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, movies especially, because you have such a massive return on investment on how much they cost to make, right?
Yeah, like Blair Witch and stuff,
Blair Witch was it famously made for like 10 or 20 grand? Camping equipment, the cameras, check. I don't know how much you have to pay for a witch for a couple of shoots, but
20-30 grand only. What about the actors? What do they get paid?
There were the people that were making it.
Hopefully they were on a percentage.
Oh, okay.
But of course, like, horror games cost a lot more to make, or now they do anyway. I mean, if you start looking at the Dark Pictures
The
anthology
supermassive games, yeah.
the supermassive games.
Yeah.
I mean, those are like, if there were a horror game, a horror film, they were cheap to make, but they're a horror game that's kind of like a horror film that has a whole interaction to it, and that's not going to be cheap to make, right?
I think like bringing up Supermassive and their approach to how they did horror, that's possibly a good way to look at maybe the contrast of the more West versus East approach. So the most recent one is probably Evil Within in terms of a horror IP that came out like quite recently. It was quite new and made it into the mainstream. And then the Western more approach was to make this kind of interactive horror movie with all these kind of bending and branching stories, because it does encourage replayability and stuff like that as well. And it is this kind of eerie, very tense sort of thing. Because if I remember rightly, in Until Dawn, the creature was always alluded to. You didn't really see it very often, but the tension was built up, and like the piercing and everything was actually done. So it was like a typical horror movie you were playing through.
And you can also see the setting of it. The setting was just a few teenagers at a sort of cabin in the
woods.
mountains. So it's not really, it's not really very Japanese, right?
Exactly.
It's super American.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most American thing you can have. Like the blonde girl, the geek guy,
Yeah.
I don't know, those just the stereotypes, which are really good to use when you know how to like write proper characters. And I think Until Dawn did it deliberately. Like they deliberately had these characters that were very specific because they're the stereotypes and the archetypes that you find in horror movies usually. And I think they did a really good job when it came to like creating the whole backstory for Until Dawn and how everything worked. I really enjoyed that game. I think it lacked a little bit of in terms of dialogue and you as a player not knowing exactly how things would turn out. There was no sometimes you did things and something else happened completely, so you didn't have the ability to understand its design and what were the rules of that game. But other than that, I think it was a pretty great attempt at making an interactive movie / horror game.
It felt like almost when that came out, it was like this new genre of kind of like, obviously we'd had Life is Strange and like The Walking Dead and stuff from Telltale up until this point, but it did feel it was this little
Don't forget
niche,
David Cage games.
not horror games though.
Okay, but the gameplay was there from.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it was an interesting take on how to make another niche within the survival horror genre, or horror genre, sorry.
Well, I mean, those are like quite movie-like ones. I've loved the recent, and this from all over the place, collection of very indie horror games coming out. Have you guys seen this? Is it the Dark Eggs collection? I'm going to put a link in the bio for the things because I'm getting the names wrong. They're like, it's like 10 indie games that you can go and play for that, which is kind of, they're all taking inspiration from the early Japanese games in a way. Sorry guys, there's a whole range of games. They're not all taking inspiration from that, but it's that kind of lo-fi style, but also sentiment. I don't know how to explain it more. That brings back kind of the idea of these horror games. I mean, I remember the first time I saw Silent Hill. It is this strangeness to the Western audience, right? Because it's not the slasher, which is what we're used to generally in Western. Right, there's only like so many different. You either have monster in the house or some weirdness, but Silent Hill was like so topsy-turvy and with foreign concepts. Even though everyone was American and the music was American, it just didn't, fit the expectations.
And Silent Hill was a psychological game too, so it required a lot of patience, and that's something that ties in with what Rob said previously. Publishers want something that will sell, 10 millions of copies instead of 3 millions of copies. So it's much harder to convince someone that this level with this horror like jump scares and this gameplay is going to be good enough, because horror doesn't come together until the very end. It's very hard to make sure that what you're doing is going to be good, and it also has a niche audience too. Like not everybody is going to play a horror game. So it's even harder to create that kind of genre when it comes to video games.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most brilliant things about it in a way, because it's created a very fertile environment for indie developers, even one person to create horror games on their own. I think that the wonderful stuff that I'm seeing now is carrying on a grand tradition of of reacting to myths and legends, and now urban legends, and things that have grown up on the internet just quite recently. So you've got games like Slender Man, you've got games about Siren Head, all from creations of Trevor, whose name I've forgotten, who creates these amazing creatures that everyone sort of builds mythologies around on the internet. It's really, really brilliant things, and they're quite, they're very, very low budget games. They're produced by one person using asset store assets, but they're great fun, and really, really, really great fallout from the thing that Val was saying. The fact that publishers don't want to take a risk on what is a really big budget. I mean, any game now is big budget. So it creates a space where there's a hunger from the audience to want to play more and more horror games, which is being filled by indies.
And games have become more expensive to make, I think, and that's when we also saw horror games kind of like dim out, and there were like the new consoles coming out, and if you're gonna create a game, you have to create something that will sell. So it's going to turn Dead Space 2 into Dead Space 3, and I think that's like the big differences that we saw with horror games. They started becoming more action and shooty in a way. For example, like we have Resident Evil 3, 1, 2, 3, and then we have 4, which obviously implemented the third person camera, which is great, but it also started becoming more shooty. And then we've got 5 and 6, which are completely, for me, they're absolutely there's no horror in them. It's not scary anymore. It's just monsters, and you kill the monsters.
I think one of the greatest recent horror games was, wasn't recent now, sorry, I'm showing my age, was a reaction to Japanese sort of legends and things, was Fear.
Yeah.
Where you had a creepy little girl wandering around with black hair over her face, which was really taking on the kind of the reference from the Ring and stuff like that. Yeah, it was an amazing action game. It had really brilliant AI, had fantastic level design, and it was a really brilliantly made game. So I think there's a space there for this, like we've been talking about, this cross-pollination between East and West and what other people are doing.
Yeah, we're not here to bash on like the differences. We're not here to say, publishers don't care about horror games, or like the Western games are not as great as they're just different. And I think that we're also lacking a little bit, or maybe we're just nostalgic of the games we used to play on PS2, and we kind of want to see that come. Maybe we just want to see a game like that, maybe, but it doesn't mean that any of the games, like for example, there's a lot of people who love Resident Evil 6, although it's not the same as Resident Evil 1 anymore. So it's just different audience, and it exists for different reasons.
I think also it's like using Resident Evil as the example. I think it depends on what your first one was. So if it was 1, 2, or 3, then you're probably instantly going to dislike 5 and 6. But if your first one was 4, you're going to be much more likely to accept what 5 and 6 became. Like for instance, 5 for me was a fun co-op action game, but not a scary game whatsoever. 6 I didn't really enjoy. But what I was going to say, obviously, we said publishers won't take real risks on horror games. Like, I feel unless you're an established brand at this point, and Resident Evil's the prime example of this, it's still going. Obviously, they went back and played it safe and remade 2 of the original Resident Evils, but they're still going ahead with the franchise, right? 7 took a massive pivot and detour from what we expect from it, but it turned out really well for them. It kind of, I feel that reinvigorated the franchise. So I am interested to see where it goes going forward with their Village.
Yeah, that's why we have Resident Evil Village now coming out. That's probably inspired from Resident Evil 7 rather than from the remakes.
Yeah.
I mean, has any of you played Resident Evil in VR? Resident Evil.
I played Resident Evil 7 in VR a bit, yes. And
how was that?
Apart from being a bit confusing, because whenever you move or something is about to happen, like when like one of the characters is going to attack you, there's a black cutout, and then it happens. Whereas when you play a game, there's no cuts like that normally when you play. So apart from that, which was a little bit off for me, I think it was a pretty horrible experience in a good way. I played it the second time. So I played Resident Evil 7 normally, and then I played it the second time. I knew everything that was going to happen, and yet it was still really nice to experience that. Even though I knew the jump scares and everything, it was pretty cool. I think VR definitely has a lead when it comes to horror games.
As a designer, you have to take a lot gentler or lighter touch in some points, I think, because
Can be almost too overwhelming.
right,
Mhm.
exactly. I think I did one game once in VR, and I think it just jumped out, and I was like in in the editor, and that was like, this is literally not scary. This is like a box jumping out, you know. But when I tried it in VR, I think I nearly fell down, and I designed it. You know, listeners might realize that I'm a bit of a chicken when it comes to horror. So yeah, I'm absolutely great with that.
Like what Mark's describing, it might have been a simple prototype, but just everything is amplified in VR. So you can get the smallest of things that doesn't impact you or make you jump or anything in a third person game will get to you probably in a VR scenario.
And that horrible feeling that you are somewhere else is accentuated massively. I think we talked about Dread Halls in previous episode, which had a very horrible atmosphere and the expectation that you were going to be jumped out on. It wasn't a very complicated game design, but in VR it was extremely effective because it put people in an extremely alien and horrible place that they knew something bad was going to happen in there.
And also, like we were talking in the last episode, we were talking about like 90-degree corners, right? Now in VR, you have like the ability to, like that doesn't work as well because you can literally just peek out a little. By the way, listeners, everyone in the podcast is now looking around the corner, so I
Just
wish I could have
leaning
got a
left and
screenshot of
right.
that. We're just leaning left and right. So that that trope or that design go-to doesn't work as well compared to things that you might have to look underneath a desk and something peeks out, as an example, right? So I think there needs to be, for VR especially, designing VR, you need to create a new language. And I think so I saw someone playing Alien Isolation in VR, which that takes a lot more rectal fortitude than I personally have. I think I'd be far too scared as it is. But with that, you can see, you have the fight or flight instinct, but you can kind of like just peek around a little bit and see where the alien is, where you'd have what's it called, higher limits, because you can only peek out so far with a controller, or you can be very delicate and see the tail or something like
Yeah,
that.
you can design things differently in VR. If you see that a lot of players are just picking from behind corners, you can maybe design jump scares or something that the alien is kind of standing around the corner, or sometimes will be around the corner, so you'll be more scared to like do that. So that kind of will stop you from overusing the mechanic. But like you said, it's a whole different language, because if you imagine a game that has a lot of VFX and maybe just general post-processing in their game, and suddenly you are in VR, all of that is going to be really dizzying. And even animations that the first person character did, like, I don't know, fainting and falling on the floor, if you do that in VR, everybody's just going to fall together with the character. It's very dizzying, and those kind of things have to be accounted for and even removed. So it changes the game a lot. You have to think, if you're going to make a game in VR, I think it has to be, you have to know from the beginning, this is going to be in VR because the design is going to depend on it.
From a character controller point of view, like what you were saying, you can't make them fall down. So if you just got to strip everything right back, it becomes the most basic character. You've got hands and you can grab stuff, and that's about it. It's all the other systems that suddenly become 10 times more important because you can't make them fall out. So it's cut to black. If anything happens to you, it's like cut to black, something happens, and like that's kind of it. There's not really anything else you can do right now without making the player be sick, be nauseous, or disconnect, which is what you want to avoid.
I mean, if we're talking VR, I mean, Half-Life Alyx is a great example. I realize it's not sold as a horror game, but you got face huggers, and that, or just that head crabs. Or, sorry, not face huggers.
You're mixing your franchises terribly there, Mark.
I'm sorry. I was still scared of Alien Isolation. All right, I'm still quivering about Alien Isolation, but already you have something on your face. And just having this image of something jumping on your face whilst you have a big VR helmet already puts me into slight, a fight or flight.
That first person in your face thing is why VR is so scary. That kind of first person attacks right in your face, because you are quite defenseless. You can't protect yourself in VR. And that's a mechanic that's been used in games before VR was even a mainstream thing. So you've got games like Fatal Frame and Outlast, and Clive Barker's Undying. What those games have in common is they have a device in the game, whether it's a camera or a video camera or a kind of second sight thing that
That was in Undying,
in Undying, yeah, that you can look through at certain points in the game. And the action of that is to concentrate your attention on a certain chunk of the screen in a very intense way. So when jump scares happen in that situation, when you're looking through the camera or looking through the second sight thing, they're much more effective because you've put yourself into another level of presence in the game, because you're saying, okay, I'm accepting that I'm a character holding this thing, and now I'm going to look through it. And so you almost become the character. It's a kind of, I would say it's like a different level of consciousness almost. And I remember in Undying, I was watching someone play it, and they just looked at some picture of some two people and then turned on the second sight thing, and of course they turn into these sort of horrible demonic people, and I gave a very pathetic yelp and jumped back.
I think there's going to be some interesting games coming up. There's some new technology called LiDAR, and mobile phones and iPads are now allowing you to use them as second cameras, without whole motion tracking rigs. So I've done some tests, and this is not to show off anything. This is one of the apps that Unreal Engine gives you, that you're able to navigate the virtual camera in your game engine with an iPad. So you're actually moving it around. And that could also be a very interesting, second screen,
The canny game developer could make someone quite disturbed by that if you were to insert some presence into someone's house through the AR game. That,
right.
You were playing a game which you didn't realize was a horror game. Well, you knew it was a horror game, but you were looking through the.
You can change the color of your sofa,
and then suddenly you get a figure in the background. And you think, oh, what's that? Who's that? And that's the thing that's been in ghost stories since mirrors were a thing, is that the mirror is a horrible portal to another world. And that I know people who won't look in a mirror when it's dark still, even after 20 years of not being a child. I'm not saying that's me, but they won't look in a mirror when it's dark because they think, oh, I'll see a figure behind me if I look in a mirror when it's dark.
I mean, mirrors are scary in the dark because you can see yourself, but you don't really see yourself. You only see some highlights, and your face suddenly becomes scary. It's
I read one of the scariest ghost stories I've read. I can't even remember who did it. I think it may have been someone like Roald Dahl or someone. But there was some guy who goes to a house and there's all these mirrors, and he's there on his own. And then he realized that in the mirror there's something stalking him and moving through the rooms behind him, that he can only see them in the mirror. Really, really horrible. I read it late at night once and couldn't get to sleep.
Yeah, thanks, Roll.
Yeah. One thing I will say about that, though, that's a super fun game mechanic just right there. Like a house of mirrors where something's chasing you through the mirrors.
Well,
now we've got ray tracing. Can make the first ray traced horror game.
So only the 100 people will be able to play it on their PCs.
See, niche. Sticking to the malls.
Very niche.
I mean, come on, VR is niche. You might as well go for the people with a double RTX card.
I'm selling it to only one person.
Yeah. Well, the guy that's playing Crisis.
Absolutely, yeah.
One thing that got me thinking while you guys were talking about all these different games is that we didn't actually talk about the difference between level design in a horror game and level design in just a normal game. Like, what do you think is the most important tool for a level to be designed when you're designing a horror game?
Hiding stuff, as in, I would say, if we're talking about the 90-degree thing, I mean, the other thing that could come to mind is, if you have a whole bunch of doors from the left and the right, and you have to walk down that corridor, and you never know when something's going to jump out, right? It's the same as the right-angled corridor, right? Because you have to get right up to it to turn it. I mean, I think that's one part, like being able to having very obscured entryways. Sorry, I was thinking about this.
We could talk about the architecture, and we could also talk about the pacing.
Yeah.
So, for example, with pacing, when you are making a horror level, you have to be very careful not to keep the tension too high for too long, because people get tired of it and they'll either just stop playing or they won't get what you're trying to do. Any other ideas about the pacing and things like that?
I think in horror games in particular, especially in the level design, it's being able to easily distinguish between kind of like what is a safe area. And because without those, you can't really do pacing well because you don't know when you're in like a respite zone or whatever. And like, you've got to build that language with a player, or you get stuck at 11. And then, like Rob said, eventually you say, this is horrible. This is this torture. I don't want to be at 11. When am I going to be safe? And that the concept of safe space has existed since like the original Resident Evils, right? You had the safe room. It's just how we interpret it.
That was the best feeling, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You went to the safe room and there was like a save point and you're like, oh yes, I can relax now. Although there is a glitch in the recent games where the enemies can kind of a little bit glitch out into the door and they'll go in and then they'll they'll back out and you can't see them backing out for no reason.
Yeah. But it's
But that's also a mechanic, right? Is that like you have like the battle areas or the areas where you can be attacked and the safe spaces. But you can subvert that later on in the game because once you've gotten used to these safe spaces, and then you don't have to specifically attack the player in there. But if, let's say, I'm going to use Alien Isolation as an example. If you've got areas that you know that the alien can't get in, right? And it's your little stash place that you're safe. If you come back to it and you see that the alien has been there, right?
It's a new scare, like you're terrified. Oh no, is this not safe anymore?
Right.
Speaking of Alien Isolation, I think one of the things that Rob said about the pacing, I think Alien Isolation had a lot of, I don't know, like scary, prolonged sections where you couldn't rest. And you can hide in a locker, but that's not ideal. That's just hiding. But there were sections where you were just scared because the alien was around, and then you would walk up a flight of stairs and you think, oh, okay, I'm gonna chill a bit, but nope, it's another area where the alien can be around. You never knew clearly when you were safe enough and when the alien would be around. So sometimes it would keep up the tension for a long time, and you have to take breaks by just leaving the game yourself instead of continuing to play the game.
I think there were areas, and I might be wrong, that you encountered a different sort of threat that you could manage very easily, but you knew that the alien wasn't going to be around, like the Worker Joe's areas.
Yeah, there were some of those areas, but they're still scary, right?
Absolutely. But I think it was like, oh, it's a different level of, you've just ratcheted it down a little bit, you know, which is still variable. I don't know about the Dark Pictures type games. Do they have, I guess it's interactive. So
those are very movie-like, so I don't think, like, from my experience playing them, I don't really think there's a level design, I don't know, kind of like benefit to that, because they're all very linear. They're all very specific and very narrative driven. So it doesn't matter where you go. It's literally, it's going to be either a room on the left or straight ahead. There's not a lot of exploration. And then
they don't have exploration, you're right, but they do still have the concept of pacing. But obviously, because it's a linear, it's a case of the player choosing to stop to explore a space or talk. Yeah, it'll be like you're in a room. Before you progress, you can have some optional conversations with a character before you move on to your next scare or whatever, before you hit the next like high intensity bit. But yeah, it tends to follow more of the movie pacing structure than a typical gaming pacing structure.
You know, I could totally see that as a great game to play with others, right? You know, it's like a movie. You can watch it, like, oh, what did you do? Like, we got a few seconds, all right, do this. And it doesn't matter your choices are too wrong. Do you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, they'll remember that. Well done.
Yeah. I think one other thing when it comes to pacing is, when it comes also to level design, is that you have to create areas where nothing will happen, and then you're just working on them for so long, and you just, oh, what are you working on? Anything exciting? No, I'm working on the literally most boring area because it needs to exist before the exciting area and after another exciting area. So there's going to be a lot of, I guess, in AAA maybe game, like horror games, there's going to be a lot of asset creation and just a lot of production done for areas that nothing is going to happen.
Yeah, but that's the important part.
Yeah. I mean, it's important. That's what I was trying to say. It's like really important to create those areas, even though maybe there's not as much gameplay, I guess, in that way.
Yeah, those are the places where you can explore your backstory and explore the relationship between the characters in this story and fill them with things to look at and see and do, so the player knows they are mostly safe, so they can exactly let their guard down a bit. And you could introduce a game mechanic like Silent Hill's radio, which is very good to say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the radio starts hissing, you go, oh no, there's an enemy nearby. But you're not you're very rarely going to be surprised by, you know, just something that's going to jump out on you. It just doesn't really happen. So you have that warning, you have that ability to switch off a bit when you don't hear the radio hissing. Yeah.
Do you sometimes think that some of the design is too on the nose? Because I remember when I used to play PS2 games, I would sometimes feel, okay, I'm in a safe area now. I don't have to worry about anything. I can just completely let my guard down. And then you'll know when you're approaching something that is about to happen. It's kind of the same when you play an Uncharted game, when you see like props placed on the floor. Oh, it's a combat area. Something's going to happen here. It's the same. Did you guys have any experience with recent games that maybe made you feel like that?
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. It can be, if you have a very unsatisfying divide between those safe, calm areas and the areas where things happen, that where you start having big action. I think it's one of the most divisive elements of Silent Hill Shattered Memories, in that there was explicitly no combat or really any scares in the normal world, and it was only when you went to the ice world that you started getting chased. And I think a lot of people felt that spoiled the tension of the places when you weren't in the ice world, because you knew you were safe. And some people like that. Maybe people are sort of clocked differently. So they go, yeah, I want to be under threat all the time. Those are the people who really, really enjoyed Alien Isolation, I imagine. I found it just, like other people have said, I found it too intense or too long, and I had to take a break every now and then and just say, I can't play anymore because I've died and I don't want to do that again, or I just can't see the way through at the moment, so I'm just going to take a break.
Speaking of the tension in Alien Isolation, I remember there was this one moment at the kind of like the first hour or two of the game where you had to wait for the tram to arrive, and there was this music and it was slowly building up, and you just had to wait in that area, and you were looking back because you just encountered the alien in a cutscene. It was the first time, well, you didn't see the alien, it just dragged someone into the vent or whatever, and you were kind of going and you encountered the tram and you're waiting for it, and there's the music building up, which was great music too. So it's like, oh no, it's coming. Where am I gonna hide? There's nothing you can do. The tram arrives, you get in, and that's it. Then nothing happens. It was building the tension so much, and nothing happened, just with music.
There is a great article, and I'll post it in the show notes actually, which is by someone called Jared Mitchell, and they said creating horror through level design, and they're saying which parts of your core game loop you want to introduce like a horrible event. I mean, if this is more of a scare type subversion of expectations, so we've got like, you know, your game loop generally where you have like a problem presented to the player, they're basically observing it, taking it in, then they plan a potential solution to a problem. So at that point they've got the peak cognitive load of like trying to think about how to solve the problem, and then they execute the solution to the problem, and then you get a reward for doing that. You know, if it's successful, you get a reward. If it's unsuccessful, you get a punishment, and then you go and get the next problem. Right? You've got this core loop that you're cycling through, and as we design levels, we're trying to kind of like, you know, design around that. So we're trying to show them like the problem on the other side, and then they're trying to figure out how to do it. And the article goes into really good areas where to present scares for the player. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good way to do that.
There are some games that are lovely the way they reward a kind of player compartmentalization of their objectives and brain. So games like System Shock 2, where you have a whole load of things that you're worried about. You've got a objective from Showdown or Polito, and you have to do that, and you also need some more ammo, you need to repair your weapon, you need to find some chemicals to do some research, you need to get through a locked door, and you've got all these things you're juggling, and then you have enemies wandering around making noises, and you think, oh no, there's an enemy nearby, and so you're juggling all this thing and you're working out priorities, and those can be super satisfying games, just giving the player the ability to go, oh look, there's loads of things happening, come on, work out what it is you want to deal with first.
And when to exactly have the scary moment happen, like what Mark said. I think that's why we see a lot of horror games. Hey, once you've collected the key, you just know something's gonna happen when you backtrack to open that door. You
Right.
just know it.
Yeah.
So that's why some games revert that expectation. Nothing happens. But what happens once I open the door? Will I then get the jump scare that I was waiting for? So it's like sometimes you already know as the player and as an experience, like, I don't know, horror movie fan or horror game fan, if you already did seen this before, you kind of expect when things are going to happen. So it's really interesting reverting those expectations and maybe having your scares elsewhere too.
Yeah, and you can do it the other way as well. Do you play Ethan Carter?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Vanishing of Ethan Carter. So I went down in this mine, and like I was just like, there's nothing else that nothing had happened in the entire game, no enemies or anything. I was just bimbling around looking at the scenery. Turn a corner and there's this bloody zombie right in my face. I fell on
I
the
don't
floor
remember
with
that. What?
shock. Yeah, it was like this sort of thing that it's like a ghost of a miner or something. Oh God, it was really
That's-
that.
Oh
Really,
that's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
yeah, it was because I didn't see it, and I think it was scripted to appear at the end of a corridor, and you're meant to see it and go, "Oh shit, there's something coming! I better run!" And then there's like a maze. The level design there is kind of a maze, and you go round and round corners a few times, and you're meant to try and lose it. And I must have just been looking the wrong way when it spawned or came around the corner, and so I was looking something else on the ground maybe, and then I turned a corner, and this thing was right in my face, and it was just it's like Val was saying, it subverted the expectations, but completely the other way around, because I really didn't expect that kind of gameplay in the game up to then.
I think that's what horror games have become though, right? Because now we've played them for so many years, if we've been gamers for such a long time, we now expect to get jump scares at certain points. So it is now playing the game of, we need to subvert all those expectations. So you have to move where the scare is, and you have to continually be changing it as well. So you can't just have it occur at the same point every time. So every time I get the key to unlock the door, something's going to jump out at me. It has to happen at a different point in time each time you fulfill a requirement or complete an objective.
And that's why you want to subvert it, because you have that tension there, right? Because you know that's going to happen. That's how you can subvert it, right? Saying like, "Oh, I've got the key. All right, something's going to happen," and you don't let it happen, and then you like give them some rope, and then you just like get them out.
That makes me think about something we were discussing earlier about how horror games don't get funded and how horror games have this really weird relationship with the market. I think the horror series that have done well and have survived, if you compare Resi and Silent Hill, I think that Resi has always evolved. Resi has always taken things to a new area and mixed it up and done new things, whereas Silent Hill is almost become a sort of exercise in nostalgia. And where it succeeds, it succeeds when it changes, and it doesn't succeed when it's more of the same. And I think that's why Dead Space died out. And I think Dead Space should have died out, because Dead Space was amazing. Dead Space 2 was great. And then after a while, I think that people go, well, I've seen all this. I think that publishers need to be more daring in terms of going to new places. That's where horror is at its best, is when you get a new thing coming in. And I think it's when horror is at its weakest, when you get sequelitis that tries to retread past glories, but sort of through a mirror darkly. So each time they become a reflection of back to mirrors, a reflection of what was good about the game, and it loses more and more of the thing, and people are more and more familiar with the what makes that series special, what makes Silent Hill special, and they become bored with it. And to revive Silent Hill with like with what PT did, was to take it into a very strange new place, to get rid of the cliches and tropes that Silent Hill have built up, and get rid of the radio in the town, and just go into
Pyramid Head and
exactly
like that, right?
exactly, and go into a new gameplay area, a new story area, and that's where horror should continue innovating.
And yet they still need to retain the core of what they initially set out to do.
Yeah, that's very tough.
Do they? I mean, I say do they? I don't want to be antagonistic.
Has Resi kept its core? Yeah.
Resi
That's what I was
7
gonna
did
bring up.
have I think this similar, like you would play it and it's the puzzles that Resident Evil will have, this weird as puzzles that we have, and yeah, it's first person now, but it still has the inventory, and it still has some of the magic you would see.
But you probably
in
wouldn't
the
like
first
it if it was Raccoon PD in every single one.
No, you wouldn't like it if
Resident
it was
Evil 7,
if it was the same exact one. But Resident Evil 7, even though it changed stuff, it still had some of its like, I guess,
It's core identity.
landmarks, or what do you call it? Like, yeah, some of the same stuff retained. So I think if someone who is going to create the new Silent Hill, they also have to know the history of Silent Hill. So in order to change something, you have to know what it was,
and try to avoid it. So like, no, we know it. We're not going to retread that part. And this is where films like Aliens kind of went really well, because like you had Alien and Aliens, and I'm sorry to bring it back to that, Alien 3, which was much to grind, and then they started losing their mojo. But there was a big difference over decades.
Mm-hmm. But that's really hard to do, though. What Rob mentioned, it's really hard to take something, know it by heart, and then say, you know what, we have to change it, but also keep the core alive. How do you even do that? That's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, Silent Hill 4 was not meant to be a Silent Hill game, as far as I'm aware. It was going to be another game. Silent Hill Shattered Memories, I can exclusively reveal, was not meant to be a Silent Hill game. It was called Cold Heart. It was called Cold Heart, and it was not a Silent Hill game, but it was turned into a Silent Hill game. These publishers, they know the power of the IP, but it is a real challenge to continue an IP without evolving it. You must evolve.
Shattered Memories was evolved, right? You would say it's a different Silent Hill game, even though it had Alessa or like whoever else, Harry Mason or whatever.
And it's really funny that there was a certain number of the fans who and there's this feedback between the fans and the publishers. There were a lot of fans who were very unhappy about Shattered Memories because it retconned things, because it retold the story. People were unhappy with it, and because it had major changes in gameplay, people were saying, this is not the Silent Hill I want. This is not the nostalgic joy that I was expecting.
And I think that's very problematic, because you're never going to get that, right? Unless you do Resident Evil 2 remake of exactly the same thing, but with higher graphics, right? And that's what's sold. What do you want? A remake of Silent Hill 1 and 2 with higher graphics?
It would still be different,
maybe,
though, right? Resident Evil 2 remake was still different. It still evolved, maybe kept, I don't know, it was in the same setting, the same people, whatever, same story, but it evolved. With the map, it was different, the inventory was different, like the level design was
Rob's meant to talk about the evolution, like horror has to evolve with like the changing times, and it is important to establish, I guess, what an IP, so not just an individual game, what the IP's core identity is, and then evolve that with new mechanics that are coming along with the times. And like Val said, Resident Evil 2 remake, yes, same characters, same location. When I played that game, it did feel very familiar in like a good way. The nostalgia kicked in, but also felt very new. Like the gameplay was different because the character control was evolved. Obviously the graphics are 10 times bigger, like inventory system was slightly redesigned, saving and things like that. They evolved a simple formula, but they didn't like reinvent it. And I think that's one thing that some horror games feel at, is they try to reinvent everything, and that's where it loses its identity.
But we should ask like our listeners what your favorite horror remake is. They should tweet us at Level Design FM.
Or what remake they really want to see.
Oh yeah, even better. And then we tally that up and sell that information over to, because remember, I joke. No, tell us actually what would be the best remake. So get in touch with us. Tell us what your favorite remake is or could be. And that's been it from us. I'm Mark Drew. Good night.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
The Level Design Podcast has been a Command Studio production. Our editor is Matthew Lever, and this episode has been produced by Bridie Rose.